Thanks, Bethany. So this guides us into the first session. I think most people are now with us. Welcome, Fiona. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Glad you sorted all your problems and everything. So, John and Chris. So, John, I think you're going to be bringing the slides up, and
yes,
then
I'll just share my screen,
and then I'll hand over to you, John, to introduce yourself, and for Chris and Andrew as well to introduce themselves to the group.
Right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can see those slides. Have they come up okay?
Fine.
Great. I'm John Wilkinson. I'm an associate with the IPC. I'll introduce my colleagues in a second. But just in the purpose of the first part of the session up until the break is threefold. So we're going to explore some of the key challenges facing children's services from a commissioning point of view. Consider models of engagement and intervention to address those challenges. That's the key thing, to be able to try and solve those challenges, and explore the skills and knowledge that you'll need as directors of children's services in this area. So 3 contributors, and I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. Chris, do you want to go first?
Hi, everyone. Good to be here. I'm Chris Sievers. I'm the titles changed Executive Director of People Services at South Gloucestershire Council and the DCS.
Apologies, Chris. And Andrew?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Rome. I operate as Revolution Consulting, working pretty exclusively in the children's social care commissioning space.
Thanks, Andrew. And I've been with the IPC for about 18 months, but my background before that was about 30 years in local authorities, starting out as a social worker, but also with quite a long period as AD for children's commissioning in 2 authorities. So in terms of the session outline, we're going to try and cover 4 things, but we're going to move quite quickly with the first 3 so that we can get to the exercise on strategic commissioning in redesigning early help services. So I'm going to try and keep things moving quite quickly, and I'm sure Mark will keep us to time if we stray. The session's structured around 4 key questions, so we're going to run it as a conversation. I'm going to start off by giving some concepts and a couple of basic models to try and get the conversation going. And then Chris is going to come in with some reflections and thoughts of what it's like from a practical point of view as a director of children's services. And hopefully there'll be time for 1 or 2 questions on each of those from you. But as I said, we want to make sure we've left enough time for the exercise at the end. So those 4 key questions are about the ability the DCS has to shape children's services in practice, the extent to which strategic commissioning is the right tool to affect change, about the skills that you need to be effective, and finally about who are the right partners and how do you work with them to deliver a change. Okay, but just to get us warmed up with a bit of interaction, we thought we'd use Mentimeter to generate a word cloud. I think you've all used this before, either on this course or elsewhere. You can join either by using the QR code, which is on the screen now, using your phone, or going to the menti.com website and entering the code that's on the screen at the moment. So what we want you to do is to enter a word or words that you associate with commissioning. Please 1 word at a time. You can do multiple entries, but it'll work better if you put in single word submissions. So if everyone gets on to Menti, we'll then start viewing the word cloud as it emerges. Okay, Bethany, let me know when you think most people are on.
Most people are on, John, if you come down.
Okay, I'll stop sharing so that Bethany can share the word cloud with you.
Can you see the cloud?
Yeah, no, that's coming across. It's very
You've
interesting. It's still been developing. I think it's settling down now.
Yeah, you've had 16 participant entries.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I mean, one of the things that stands out from that is the sheer number of different words that people have come up with. So it's obviously got a lot of different associations. The things at the center are value and process, which is quite interesting. Certainly trying to achieve value for money is a vital part of it. And there's a lot of process involved, but it shouldn't be purely about process. Anyone else want to come in on the word cloud? Chris, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'm with you, John. I think it's really interesting. There are such a wide variety, and there's kind of no really clear kind of thinking about this from the participants. I love the one about panic. Oh my goodness. I hope that we can go through and talk about that a little bit, because there's really nothing to be panicking about. John's right, you know, the process and the value, absolutely, that's part of it. I'm interested that outcomes hasn't come out more strongly, albeit there's two slightly different wordings of outcomes in there. Because for me, that's absolutely what commissioning is all about. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and hopefully seek to overcome some of that panic.
Great. Okay, so shall I go back to my slides? Okay, have they come across again?
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. So the first question, what ability does the DCS have to shape children's services in practice? So as I said, we're going to start off with a couple of concepts, and this is a definition of commissioning. I mean, there's lots of definitions of commissioning. This one comes from the Children's Commissioning Support Programme. So commissioning being the most efficient, effective, and equitable and sustainable route to get from all the inputs across the children's services system to the outcomes that you want to achieve for children. Three things I'd highlight about that. The first is the focus on outcomes, picking up on what Chris just said. That's the key aim, is to improve outcomes. Secondly, that commissioning is neutral about how to achieve those outcomes. So the actual route that you achieve those outcomes is what a good commissioning process is all about, trying to find that route. And then the third thing is, if you look at the inputs graphic on the left-hand side of the slide, it's the sheer range of those different inputs that you're trying to influence. And many of those things are outside of the direct control of the DCS or even of the local authority as a whole. So things like markets and communities and so on, they're things that you may wish to, or you certainly will wish to influence and engage with, but they're not things that you can control. When given the focus on outcomes, it's a reasonable challenge to ask whether that graphic shouldn't be the other way around, whether you shouldn't start with defining the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and then look at what inputs are going to be necessary and what things need to be in place across the system to achieve those outcomes. I think the answer is probably that you could look at it both ways. So Chris, what's your experience about shaping children's services in practice? What influence does the DCS have?
Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is more than you think. And part of the reason why I say that is because I think if you look at, and I know you've got later on the agenda later, kind of wicked issues, and there's a lot that we're dealing with, isn't there? So we've got rises in demand, we've got pressures on families, increased pressures on families, pressures around our workforce to make sure that we've got the right people coming through when we're retaining people in the profession, sufficiency challenges, making sure children get the right kind of provision that supports them in a really difficult market. And it can seem like it's just too difficult. These are all national issues, and it is easy to say they're national issues. Everybody's struggling to recruit, everybody's struggling with sufficiency. But the reality is each of us is tasked with doing the best for the children in our area, for our children. And so, yep, there are issues, there are pressures nationally, but actually we can influence more in our local area. And that's what I'm always trying to kind of instill in my teams. One of the examples maybe I'd use is the work we did around recruitment and international recruitment. So we in South Gloucestershire, really competitive local area, struggled to keep and recruit staff. And so one of the options, we went through all kinds of, a different type of campaign, try this or that, work through retention models, and we've got a number of initiatives to support our staff to stay with us for longer. But I suppose the international recruitment was one of the biggest ones that we went through, and that was really just saying, look, we need to think outside the box here. What we've got isn't working sufficiently quickly. If we carry on at the rate we are, it'll be sort of 4 years until we've recruited to full employment, and that's just not acceptable. So what are the options? What is everybody else doing? How can we think differently? So we did all of that, had all those conversations, and then went out to market and found someone suitable. We've now got 19 social workers from Zimbabwe working with us, and have done a really great kind of induction program with them. But another example that I might use on a kind of more localized level is with our schools and our relationships with our schools in terms of delivering around inclusion and children who are not on an EHC plan, but who do need some SEND support. And the way we worked with them was to say, okay, each of you might have a small number of children who need high levels of support, or you might not be able to deliver what you want within your local school. But actually, by working in clusters, we top slice some of the school's budget, delegate some of that to each of our clusters, and then ask them to undertake together commissioning of additional trauma support, education psychology support, different types of therapies. And also we ask them to quality assure one another's work in terms of assessments, in terms of requests that they put forward. So it's really about making them, and that's been really successful. The schools really appreciate it. They work very well together. They get better value than we would get because it's much more targeted. By working together, they get better value in the market as well. And sometimes more than one cluster, if they've got similar needs across the piece, work together to commission and get economies of scale as well. So it was just an example of, it's been, quite a challenge to kind of ensure that our children are getting the right kind of support when we looked at it as on a school by school basis, but actually thinking differently about it, about how can our schools work differently together, and academies, they all work together on it. We did get a different kind of set of outcomes. So just two contrasting examples there that may be helpful for people's thoughts.
Okay, just wondering if anybody wants to come in with a question for Chris on that.
So I had a question, but I'm struggling to find the hand. But
I can't see everybody at once anyway. So
John, do you want to take the slides down when we move in?
Yes, good idea, Mark. Yep.
Yeah, it's better so we can all see each other. Thanks, John. Yeah, go for it, Kevin.
Yeah, I was just wondering about you talked a lot about the needs and things, but in terms of political dynamics, I just wondered what your experience was of when you might have had a local political challenges which gets in the way of what you want to do, and whether you've kind of succumbed to that, or did you have any tips you can share what you did to get them on board?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that, John. I don't know if you've got one you want to share as well, but managing politics is part of what I do every day. So, and a key part of that is just making sure that we plan right from the very beginning. So part of what I did when I first came into role, which I do in any of my executive roles that I've held, is work to meet with every single member of the council. I'd go on ward visits, meet them, understand them, know what they're talking about, what they're interested in, what they're concerned in. We have a strategic quartet that meets regularly, myself, the chief exec, the leader, and the cabinet member. So they're always well briefed. They always know and understand what's coming on the agenda, and they've got opportunity to kind of have the behind the scenes conversations. And I also meet regularly with opposition leads as well. So there's always a good understanding of the issues across the piece, and that's the best way to make sure that you understand one another and you've got a really good sense of what the political concerns or interests might be going forward. And yes, there's always we work in a political environment. There's always political demands. I suppose it's a question about scale, and our job is to ensure that members are briefed and understand the issues and risks, and they don't always have to listen to the advice, but we have to give it, and we have to give our best advice, no matter which political party they're involved in. And so part of what I try and do is make sure that we've got all the data, and John will be talking about this in a minute, but got all the data that backs up the position. And so that means you really understanding the data for a start, making sure that you can clearly think through, well, why is this the right option? Why is this the right process to go through to address that issue, or what that data is telling us? And very often that's enough. If they understand the background, if they understand the data, then very often that's enough. Not always, because there are sometimes political differences. And then if there do remain political differences, I suppose the key thing for me is maintaining that relationship, because that is going to be what you need for the longer term. So whatever you do, make sure you can maintain the relationship with your politicians is the best piece of advice I could give. And as part of that, just recognizing where they have a decision and decision-making powers, and where you as an officer have decision-making powers, and making sure they understand the risks and outline those risks. I did some advice for one of our members last week about an issue from the consultation that they wanted to change, the budget consultation. And they wanted to take a particular course of action that I didn't particularly agree with. I just said, I need to point out the risks here. That wasn't part of what we had consulted on. And the likely challenge from our partners or other organizations might be these three things. And what I need to make sure that you're aware of is that if they do challenge on any one of those grounds, we don't really have an argument, because we haven't, you've introduced this at a late stage, we haven't consulted on it, and therefore any challenge is likely to result in a set of further actions that we need to respond to. So, and they're still discussing that politically. But I suppose it's also worth us just remembering that for all of our cabinet members in particular, particularly for us at the moment, we've got all-out elections in May. The bit that we won't see is the challenges that they have convincing the rest of their group about council tax levels, about potentially different contracts, different youth groups, community organizations, those kind of things. We don't always get to see those. So sometimes I think our politicians are just asking for the argument, the background. Tell me why this is the right thing to do, and then I can tell the rest of my group. Not always the case, but very often it is. They just really want to understand that background argument. So it's about the relationship for me, and just recognizing our respective roles and respecting them.
Thanks, Chris. I can see Nisha's got a hand up. I think just quickly, Nisha, because we've got to keep moving with this, but Nisha.
Thanks, John. My question was around joint commissioning with partners. So where I am in my local authority, I think liaising with politicians, I find it much easier. But when we are into joint commissioning arrangements with, say, police or health, or because we have, the districts and boroughs in relation to housing and whatnot. So it's a difficult political environment. I find that arena more challenging to get everybody on board to invest strategically and together because different organizations have different priorities. Anything that works on that end, because we are in that process. So anything that would work for that will be helpful.
That's a great question, Nisha. We've got the question about partners coming up in a minute. So I'm going to ask Chris to hold that until we come on to the partners, if that's okay. Okay, I'm going to move us on to question 2. Let's get the slide back up. Sorry, it's a bit sticky this morning.
You getting there, John, or do we?
There we go.
There
Sorry,
you go.
Mark. Yeah, sorry,
No,
it's
no,
just
no.
sticking for some reason.
I was just going to see whether Bethany could jump on, but well done.
Thanks, Mark. So second question is, to what extent strategic commissioning is the right tool to affect change? Obviously, there are other tools available to you, things like workforce development programs or continuous improvement. But is strategic commissioning the right tool? I guess many of you will have seen one of these commissioning cycle diagrams before. There's various versions of it. This one is developed by the IPC, so I'm bound to say it's the best one. A couple of things to say about it. One is that it's emphasizing the fact that commissioning is a continuous cycle of analyze, plan, do and review. It's not a one-off event or process, and you have to give attention and resources and have capacity across all of those aspects of the commissioning cycle in order to deliver better outcomes for children. Outcomes are at the center of the process, or should be, and it's really important that in your role as DCS, part of your role is to make sure that that's not tokenistic or you're just paying lip service to the idea that children's outcomes are at the center. You want to genuinely achieve that. And finally, this version of the diagram is useful because it distinguishes between commissioning and procurement as two related activities. Obviously, procurement comes into play when you've actually decided that you're going to go and try and purchase a service externally. That won't always be the outcome of a commissioning process. So commissioning might lead to something completely different, such as a community development project or something to do with direct payments, personal budgets, which is not really a procurement process. So it's quite important to distinguish them, but they are closely related. And often commissioning will be about markets, not always, because love them or hate them, markets play a big part in children's services. I mean, most obviously in relation to children's placements. As you'll be aware, a large proportion of children's placements and certainly a large proportion of the expenditure is with independent providers, whether residential or in fostering. But also other areas of children's services, such as early years. There's quite a significant market with private providers in the early years field, for example. Now, this is something that Andrew's going to be talking about a lot more in his session, but this is an IPC model which highlights two related activities as part of market shaping. One is gathering market intelligence and then using that to decide what market influencing activity you're going to undertake. And then in the bottom part of the slide, it shows that that's often captured in a market position statement as a tool to set out transparently for providers as much as for anyone else what your view of the market and what you're trying to do is. I mean, to take an example, if you were to be concerned about lack of foster placements locally, you might jump quickly to the idea of a recruitment campaign. But actually, if you really understood your local market, you understood how many foster carers there are, how many work for independent foster agencies, which agencies are working in your area, which local authorities are placing children with them, you might end up having a whole different set of ideas about the sort of things that you could do to influence that market, make sure you were able to secure more of those local placements for children you're responsible for. And through the market position statement and other activity, you might have different types of conversations with providers. Okay, so frequently it will be a market shaping task. Very frequently, commissioning is a change management task. Now, I'm sure you've looked at different models of change management, either on this course or another development activity that you've done. This one is by John Cotter. It's quite a famous one, and is an 8-step model of change. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I mean, if you think of an example such as commissioning a new edge of care service, you know, superficially, it may seem that's just about getting a new service, but actually in practice, of course, you're not going to be able to commission that service unless you redirect resources from elsewhere, probably. But also you want to change the behavior of different people working in the system. I mean, particularly, for example, your social work teams, you'll want to change their behavior in terms of how they work preventatively with children and families. So it's a huge change management task, introducing a new service like that. Okay, so Chris, again, back to you. I mean, to what extent do you think that strategic commissioning is the right tool to affect change?
Thanks, John. Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. That strategic commissioning, along with place-based leadership, both in their widest sense, for me, would be the real key. So, and that's at a variety of different levels. So if I give you maybe two examples, particularly in relation to young people. One is that our public health teams, along with our schools, undertake an online pupil survey every 2 years. And it is huge. So I think last year we had 8,000 pupils, 8,000 young people respond to it. So very, very significant survey. And schools provide time during the school day for them to complete it as well. So we get a really good picture about what many of our pupils think. And one of the big surprises from the one we undertook 2 years ago was we'd asked a lot of questions about mental health. That was in the height of COVID. So we asked quite a lot of questions about mental health. And the group whose mental health, questions of bullying, questions of self-worth, those kind of things, the cohort where we got the strongest response, which came from pretty much nowhere in terms of previous responses, was LGBTQ young women. And that for us was really important learning, because that hadn't, as I said, that hadn't come from anywhere else. And that was some of the examples that they gave in their little narrative pieces, incredibly, incredibly moving. And so now we've commissioned a response to that. We've commissioned one of our local voluntary sector diversity partners to do a piece of work with a group of young women around a toolkit that both the local authority can make use of, but also schools and academies can make use of as well. But had we not kind of had that sense of and that regular ongoing understanding about the data of what do our young people think, we wouldn't have been able to respond to that in the quick way that we have. A second example, so that's kind of relatively micro level, because that's a small group of young women, but could have a much bigger impact. In terms of our youth service provision, and this was many years ago now, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, we had a significant budget challenge and members took the decision to outsource all of our youth provision. And obviously that brought a saving with it as well. But we commissioned externally and got a group two different organizations, 3 initially, and then 2 organizations to deliver in our different areas. And what happened was, because they're so good at this sort of thing, we've got some very, very good youth provision, and that's what John was just talking about in terms of understanding your market. We knew there was a strong market there. We knew they could deliver good outcomes. They used it as match funding, and every single one of those organizations got an additional match funding, to the extent whereby there was more money for youth services under the new model than there had been under the old one, which was council run only. And so we got much wider kind of buy-in for the youth provision. We got better outcomes for young people, obviously, because there were more professionals delivering it, a variety of different methods, if you like, and different activities for different cohorts of young people. And pretty much a win-win for all of us, I think, in terms of the outcomes that we got from that. But 2 quite different ones, building on what John was talking about in terms of knowing your population, knowing your market, and really being able to say, well, what is the right thing to do, knowing what I know about these different aspects of the environment.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm just looking to see if anyone's got a hand up. Anyone want to come into onto this aspect, whether strategic commissioning is the right tool? Chris.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's an observation based on what Chris has literally just said, and it touched on the previous question around when commissioning is not really driven by the outcomes, but driven by political drivers for one reason or another, and the challenges that you face around that. I was in a tri-borough, and one element of the tri-borough, but it means you've got three relationships at three different layers with different challenges. And this particular challenge was post-Grenfell, which meant that it was a completely different lens nationally that was shone on a local authority, but was part of a tri-borough. So the challenges were not only political, but were also, like you just mentioned, about the environment, the local communities that were rightly upset about a variety of things that came out of Grenfell, not necessarily to do with Grenfell, but because that highlighted other inequalities in the community that it serves. So I suppose the challenge for me in what you've just said is some elements of the service that you may explore as being outsourced, or vice versa, bringing it back in-house, is a political decision-making process. And so the question for me is the strength in your conversation, the strength in the energy to do that when you've got the backdrop of a national picture hanging over you. I'm not sure if you've got any experiences or any words of wisdom really that can kind of shine a light on that, because it will happen to all of us at some point. We will get a national
well, I think that's an incredibly challenging example, Chris, definitely. I mean, and I worked in Kensington and Chelsea for 20 years, and in fact, I used to work as a social worker in the area with Grenfell and visited families in Grenfell. So even though I hadn't worked there, I'd left years before, it was extremely upsetting, and I could only imagine the impact that it had, on my ex-colleagues in Kensington and Chelsea. Hopefully, I think you're right, everyone will face lots of different challenging situations. I'm not sure, I hope many of you don't face anything quite as challenging as that, but the one thing that occurred to me when we were talking about politics earlier after Kevin's question was, when I think, somebody said, I can't remember who, that politics is the art of the possible. And I think that's a key thing. In every local authority, there'll be different political constraints, different political priorities, and also different priorities from partners. And it's a question of what's possible in your environment. What's the best you can achieve for children in the environment that you've got to work with? I don't know, Chris, if you've got anything to add on that.
I just similar to what you've just said, it's about knowing your population and being able to advise, really, and giving your best independent advice. And yeah, no, I'll leave it there, because there's a point I want to make about innovation, but probably in relation to the next part. But yeah, I agree with you. Knowing your population, and that's not just about the data, but about the relationships with different groups. So some of this and some of the success, I think, is going to be about relationship-based working for yourself with other partners. And I include politicians and community groups in that as well. So being able to understand kind of, I think Mike made a point in the chat as well about kind of knowing where the concerns are, what the interests are, who's going to be responding positively or negatively if you take a particular course of action, and being able to advise members about that as well, because obviously they're going to want to know about that as well.
Okay, so we've got Kevin and then Ashley, and then I think we better move on. Kevin first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the impact strategic commissioning led to a kind of workforce development standards, which they then put in the tender process. And we kind of think to ourselves, there's a shortage of social workers or people with police officers or things like that. But actually what it did, the companies that came forward to provide a service then used those workforce development standards and were able to appeal to people in a different way, which meant they tapped into a workforce that we didn't know was out there. And so it made us realise that actually it's not about there not being enough social workers out there or police officers or school teachers, it's the way we're not reaching out to them and not connecting them the right kind of way and setting the workforce standards. And if we did it differently, like the commissioning, our health and social care commissioning, what we worked together to create these standards, which were more appealable and appetising for people to look at and say, I could do that work, which is really challenging. And so a lot of the services we commission are doing brilliant work, and we can already see the impact, positive impact on children. And so I think the strategic commissioning was able to reach out to providers, see what it is that they could appeal to, and they were able to then can do some stakeholder analysis and co-production, and then create these workforce standards, which have actually had a really good impact.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Ashley?
Hi, Ashley Whitaker. I work in Richmond and Kingston in Southwest London, and I've got a bit of a techie question for Chris. I wonder if you could just expand on what you said about match funding. I'm wondering if you're maybe they were charities that you commissioned, and maybe their funders matched the funding. And if that's the case, you're nodding your head. Then I'm wondering whether their funders, how their funders felt about contributing to a service that arguably the local authority should have been funding fully. And it's basically, we had some local issues around that kind of issue, where charity funders became less willing to fund a service which arguably was the role, perhaps statutory, perhaps a bit of a grey area, that the local authority arguably should have been funding fully.
That's interesting. That wasn't part of the discussions and debate that we had at the time. I mean, to be fair, we wouldn't necessarily have heard it because the providers would just maybe handle that themselves. But it's about the young people, isn't it, at the end of the day? So, you know, we, like everybody, always kind of refining, rethinking, what is it that we absolutely have to provide, what are our corporate priorities, and how do those two things fit together, because often there's a bit of tension in between them as well. But one of the other examples, which is slightly different, around care leavers and support for care leavers, particularly those particularly with complex needs and facing criminal justice or working in the criminal justice system. We've got an organization who works with that cohort of young people really, really well, a charity, a voluntary community organization. And we did some work with them around social finance, because they were really, really interested in accessing social finance. So a completely different funding route, millions available. And much more business focused. And so given the business focus and the kind of potential future for workforce and so on, we worked together, them and I worked with the leader of our council, and he worked with our combined authority, so West of England Combined Authority. So eventually WECA match funded the social finance. So actually what we've got is kind of a tripartite funding arrangement, and again, suits all of us, I think, but really a different model. First time we've entered into any kind of set of relationships like that. But I thought a really, really nice way of thinking differently about it. So it's about growing our workforce for the future. It's also about supporting our children, young people, of course it is. But in a very, very different way than we might have thought of before. But that was their idea, the VCSE organization. That was completely their idea, their doing. I just helped pave the way with our leader, who was the chair of the Combined Authority at the time, who helped pave the way with the other partners there as well in terms of workforce issues.
Great. Okay, well, I think we better move on to the next question. I'll go back to my slides. Okay, so what skills do you need to be an effective strategic commissioner in children's services? When talking about those challenges, already highlighting a lot of the skills that are needed. And I think in thinking about the skills, it's not just thinking about your own skills as DCS, it's also thinking about the skills you'll need across your team, across the whole of children's services, across your commissioning function, across the system. This is another example of one of those cycle diagrams. You'll see the analyze, plan, deliver, review, again with outcomes at the middle, at the heart of it, but it's just highlighting some of the skills and capacity, some of the different aspects of skills and capacity that are going to be needed in order to commission effectively. And again, the important thing here is to be able to have that skill and capacity across all of those aspects, and be able to, you can use this sort of model to identify gaps that you may have. So leadership and governance, we've already been talking about that in relation to some of these complexities with multi-authority arrangements, etc., and local politics. Management, and I think that could easily say project management, because there's an awful lot of project management skill involved in effective commissioning. Partnership working, that's what Nisha highlighted, and we're going to come on to in a bit more in a second, but skills in partnership working and complexities of working in partnerships. And it says production there, but I think it probably ought to say co-production. So working with children and young people, people who use services, and ensuring that their voice has an influence. And just pick up on the conversation we've just been having about some of the challenges in commissioning in a complex political environment. I think the user voice is one of the things that's very difficult for people to argue with. Another is very good data around things like costs and performance of services and so on. And those sort of things can change the conversation, even if people have got embedded views in their organization or politically. So skills and capacity across all of those aspects. And just drilling down a bit more into leadership skills, I think from what you've said already, quite a few of these have already come up. So leading partnerships in a political environment, leading budget and resource integration, extremely difficult, you know, in a environment of austerity or of high inflation like we've got at the moment. One thing we haven't picked up on yet is leading culture change across professions and across the whole system. I mean, the landscape of organizations is very complex in children's services, but so is our landscape in terms of different professional groups, professional identities. So we've got, you know, nurses, social workers, teachers, childcare workers, etc., youth workers. So it requires a very high level of leadership skills in order to find your way through these challenges. What are your thoughts, Chris, on this question of skills and leadership? I can see Ashley's got his hand up, but I think that's a legacy from the previous round. But Chris, what's your thoughts?
Thanks. So there's some skills here, but there's also some mindset for me about what might be most important. I suppose what I would say, and I say it in relation to a whole set of questions, it's all about relationships, really. It's all about relationships. So any of the work that you're going to be doing, you know, your relationship with your partners is going to be so much easier if you regularly talk to one another offline. You get that sense of what are they thinking, what are they interested in, how are we going to manage the challenges we've got. But that, coupled with the outcomes focus, and John talked about that, that outcomes focus always being focused on the young person or the child, indeed the family in some cases, that you're going to be working with, and being pretty agnostic and pragmatic about how you get those different outcomes actually opens up, or can open up, a whole range of other opportunity. And I suppose that's where it leads me to an issue about innovation as well. So I think part of this is about being able to say, I just want to think very, very differently about how we organize ourselves and how we think differently about where our top priorities are. And if I just give you one example, and John will be very familiar with this, which was about our secure unit that we run at the moment. We run a justice secure unit in South Gloucestershire. We've had some challenges with that. We don't have any of our local children in there. No South Gloucestershire children go there at the moment, and haven't done for some time. And I suppose an interesting conversation about politics earlier, our politicians said to me, why do we do this? You know, where's the benefit for our South Gloucestershire children here in running this home? And why would we not spend that money on, for example, housing and caring for young people and asylum seeking young people? We've had an asylum hotel open up in South Gloucestershire, taken more than 70 children into care in the last 9 months. So, you know, a real kind of increase in a particular cohort of young people. Why would we not just think differently about that? We talked about the budget issues, and as he keeps saying, but you keep telling me, you know, about the cost of placements and the difficulties in identifying appropriate placements and the costs. Actually, it might pay us to think very, very differently about that centre and about that home. So we commissioned IPC to look at that and think differently about, well, what are the range of options that we might have? And I say that John's familiar with it because he largely did that piece of work for us. But just that sense of opening yourself up to think, what could we do with this? Because we'd always been in the place of saying, we've got this secure children's home, we'll be working with this, we'll you know, we'll make it the best we possibly can. We'll make it the right kind of environment for young people. We have some work we need to do on restraint. We've got some work we need to do around workforce. But actually being able to lift yourself up and say, we've got an asset. Could we use this differently, given the kind of challenges that we've got? I think that innovation piece is really, really important. And part of that then as well, for me, is the other skill that's really important is your ability to analyze and make decisions off the back of that analysis, because there will be a range of information. You can get data, you can get lots and lots of data, but being able to work through and understand, well, which of these are going to be the right type of data for me to be listening to? Have I got the co-production? Have I got the voice of the child or the family in this process that helps me to make sense of that data? And then being able to kind of differentiate between, that looks like a really good idea, but maybe that one is about supporting a cohort of young people, but I know that this voluntary sector organization already does that as well. Maybe we need to think about a different cohort of young people. So being able to hold all of that and make a decision through the middle of it, I think, is one of the key skills of a DCS. So look at the complexity and find a way through it, I think, is a key task.
Right. I'm conscious of the time, because we want to get on to the exercise, and we also want to get back to Nisha's question around partnerships. So I can't see any hands, so I think I'm going to move us straight on to the next topic. Is that okay? I'm getting nods, or certainly no no's anyway, so. Okay, so this is the question around partners. Who are the right partners, and how do you work with them to deliver change? Now, obviously, you know, everyone's very familiar with this, but lots of different partners, a very complex landscape in terms of partners. The issue is not identifying necessarily all the partners, it's which are the right partners for the particular project or challenge that you're dealing with. So it could be national partners like DFE or Ofsted, regional partners. You know, we've already talked about combined authorities. You may have different types of consortia of local authorities coming together. You've got regional adoption agencies, your local commissioning partners. So that's people like the ICB and other health bodies locally, but also schools, also could be the police, local suppliers. So who are the suppliers of children's services in your area? They could be independent sector, private companies. They could also be voluntary community and social enterprise organisations. How well do you know the local suppliers in your area? And then local stakeholders, other local stakeholders, a huge range. Obviously, the children and families who are relying on your services, but also things like faith groups, community organisations, and so on. Lots of stakeholders. So the key question is, which are the right ones to be working with on the particular challenge that you're dealing with? And then you've also got to think about the level of relationship you want to have with those partners. I mean, this is beginning to touch, I think, on some of what Nisha was raising. This is a spectrum between ranging from separate to through parallel to joint to integrated commissioning. I think key thing to say about this is, although you can have those different levels of joint commissioning relationships, it takes two to tango. So it depends on what your partners, what level of relationship your partner wants. You may over time be able to move them up a level, but you need to start from where you're or recognize where your partners are at and what level of integration they want, as well as working towards you know, the level that you ultimately want to achieve. So there's a degree of pragmatism and as I mentioned earlier, the art of the possible in partnership working and working out where your partners are at, what's important to them, what are they prepared to do. We've talked about co-production. This is again, there's many versions of this ladder of participation. I think this is a particularly nice one, ranging from doing to doing with. It's from IRIS, which is the Scottish Improvement Agency for social care. I think an important thing to say with this, I mean, I think most of us would say that you should always be looking to be as high up that ladder as you can be. But of course, practical considerations do come into play. if you're dealing with a very urgent situation, such as the failure of an important provider locally, you may be limited in terms of how much engagement and participation you can do with users before you can take some action. So it's worth thinking around the level of co-production that you're looking to achieve, and there's a link with that with timescales, and obviously important to start as early as possible, given that, because co-production, doing co-design and co-production properly takes time and resource to achieve. So Chris, what are your thoughts on this around partners? I think particularly as well, thinking about Nisha's question around the complexity of working in this area and challenges that you've faced with that and how you might overcome them.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, a big part of this is about persistence and being able to just keep going, because all of us are going to be in different places, and if we're working across different disciplines, who would be surprised if actually it's difficult to come to agreement first time you have a conversation about something? We all come from very, very different perspectives. So the one example I might give is our work with our health partners and our other 2 local authorities in the health footprint around complex care. And this has been a journey, as they say. It has been a real challenge, because for ages our health partners did not want to work with us on it. It was a very confrontational attitude between all of us, to be fair, and it was a case of, well, we'll take legal action, they'll take legal action, we have a legal response, etc. And I think we just got to a point of saying, this is madness. We're not doing enough to intervene earlier, and by working together we could both be saving money. So some of that was about so what I did, talk to the other 2 local authorities and say, I think there's scope for us to look at this differently. Can we think about it differently? I was fortunate that at the same time, the director of nursing in the organization changed, and the new one was obviously up for a different kind of conversation. But it has taken literally years to get to a different place around our complex care work. And that's just about the pathways. We haven't even got to the process of saying we need to commission differently. We know that's on the agenda. We know that's coming, and that's a job for us to do, but we're not quite there yet. So I mean, I can absolutely understand Nisha's kind of concerns and about the complexity of it. And I think the new ICBs and ICPs, the partnership arrangements, still kind of finding their feet. So there's still, even amongst all of them, a kind of conversation ongoing. We've been really fortunate, and this goes back to some of the issues I talked about before about relationships. We've been really fortunate that our ICB is one of the few in the country to prioritize children in its new strategic framework, and prioritize supporting children to live different lives is in there. But that is the result, frankly, of years of debate, conversation, raising the profile of children, both, from me, my other local authority, DCSs, and our respective chief executives, to really get that kind of agenda within that strategic framework. So I completely sympathize. It has taken a lot. But I would say key people, your director of nursing at your ICB, and probably within your community providers as well, your DAS, and making sure you're on kind of good terms with your DAS. The director of public health, actually our director of public health, we have a common concern and interest in the first 1,001 days of a child's life, in all the early help work, all that sort of stuff. And then your VCSE partners, your main VCSE partners, and making sure that you've got regular contact points with them would be my suggestion. But all about the relationships and go where the passion is would be my suggestion.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hopefully that goes some way to answering your question, Nisha. I'm going to take us into the exercise now, because I think want to allow enough time for discussion. So I'll just get my slides back up. Okay, so the group exercise, you're going to go into breakout groups in a second, and I'll put up a slide with who's in which group in a moment. But the scenario is that you've agreed with all the key resource holding partners we have already seen that's not difficult, not easy rather, that you'll need to reconfigure early help and family support provision across the local authority. So it's a big opportunity because you've secured that agreement. And the focus is going to be on helping families who would otherwise need more intensive health, education or social care interventions. We want you to answer 2 questions. So the task in your group is to think about what overall approach you need to take to the task and how will co-production be considered. So what's the approach you're going to be taking, including co-production? And then secondly, what role do you as the ultimate strategic commissioner of children's services need to play? What's your role going to be in this reconfiguring of early help services? Okay. So the 4 breakout groups, we've got room 3, which is Elaine, Zoe, Amana, Joe, and Magella. Room 4 is Nisha, Andrea, Dion, and Rachel. Room 5, Ronnie, Kevin, Johnny, and Abrili. And then room 6 is Fiona, Shelley, Christopher, and Ashley. And I think we can probably run for about 15 minutes on this. So
yeah, that
15,
would be good, John. Yeah,
yep, 15 minutes in the breakout rooms. And then if each group comes back with maybe 1 key point to share before the break, that would be
and
great.
In room, sorry, John, in room 3, obviously Joe won't be with you, so it'll be recording.
Okay, and I'm not sure how this works, Mark. Is
Bethany and the team will sort it all out, and yes, Kevin, will put the questions in chat, the task.
Great. Okay, well, I'll stop sharing then, and hopefully you'll be in your groups in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully I had some interesting discussion there around those 2 questions. We want to protect your break time, but it would be really interesting to hear perhaps just 1 key point from each of the groups, or a reflection, observation. Okay, so who wants to go first? I think room 3. Should we do it in order?
I think, was that me? I think I was we in room 3. Sorry, I can't remember, John. I think it was a really good question actually for me, because I obviously had a service for early help within Warrington Borough Council, so it was a really good question. But Zoe obviously also helped us stop going into the operational side of things and looked at actually what more of a DCS role would take. It's very easy to go into the doing. So really for me, it's making sure there's a robust early help strategy as well, and that you share those responsibilities with wider key partners, because what you can by default is try and do it all as a local authority, when early help services is massive and wider, and using those key partners. So making sure you have a really good, robust co-production, workforce, workshops, community strategy as well, to make sure your vision's out there, your attendance. So as a DCS, making sure I have the team underneath me to go and do some of the operational findings. But the key thing is knowing what your area deprivation levels are, your heat maps, what the demand is, the volume. So the JSNA, providing some of the detail for that. And also working with partners and getting surveys for feedback, parent feedback, partner feedback, child feedback. Also looking at the political environment that around you, what are people sharing, what's the political agenda about, what are the national and regional trends. Also delivering some workshops to get some further feedback for some of that. So we talked about, obviously, family support is very much early help division within a lot of local authorities, and it was just clearly making sure that how we hold people to account regarding early help is everyone's business. So I did share, John, that obviously recently in Warrington we did very much the person that was authoring the early help strategy was the person that was driving it all. And actually this time we've gone for an integrated early help strategy where there's 16 partners having lead responsibilities, whether it's homelessness, financial difficulties, over it might be parenting, SEND, to make it very inclusive and owned by many, for then it's more successful. But the key thing is for me is it's not just put on a shelf, it's actually we're having to work towards what we're saying we're going to do, and it's the monitoring, reviewing that are just important as finalising a strategy.
Great. Well, thanks, Elaine. That was really rich discussion by the sound of it.
Yeah.
Somebody want to come in from room 4?
I don't think anybody can remember what room they were in.
Was that our room? Were we room 4? We didn't agree who was going to feed back. Are people happy if I just give something? We had a really good discussion, very similar to Elaine. We talked an awful lot about the governance arrangements, but we started thinking about the stakeholders that would be involved in the discussions and how we would identify those stakeholders. And then we also talked about gap analysis, very similar to Elaine, thinking about the landscape in which we're working. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? What is not, we used an example I'm working with at the moment where we've got some really good outcomes in terms of early health, but what is it that we're not achieving? So working on the basis of those things that we would expect to see that we're not, things like early health that is not, we have a high number of children in care and a high number of referrals that are coming into the local authority I'm working in. And a lot of those children have not been involved with early health services, have not had any intervention at all, and understanding that and how we would identify what is it that we are trying to achieve in terms of making sure that early health is everyone's business, but also that all children and families have the opportunity for that early health intervention and support before they're getting into statutory services. We also had a really interesting discussion about the governance and leadership and thinking about actually the role of the DCS. And we very much saw that as a lead role within this particular challenge, and that in my example is quite often you don't find that there's much of a challenge around the local authority being the lead on those type of multi-agency sort of interventions and projects. We talked about the importance, and it linked back to what you were saying, Chris, earlier on about relationships, and that actually fundamentally it's about engaging with those people that are passionate and that have the same aspirations, and they want the same outcomes for our children, because once you have them on board in terms of your leadership and governance arrangement, it's much easier to drive forward those plans. Is that a good, is that everything we covered, Rachel, beyond yeah, and Nisha? Okay.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And room 5, I have flicked across, so now I can remember. I think it had Ronnie, Kevin, Abrili and Johnny in it. So does somebody want to come in with some feedback from your discussion?
Yeah, I've put something in the chat as well, but we talked about horizon scanning because quite often we're reactive to a situation. So we're talking about if we're a DCS, we would like to have a horizon scanning session with all multi-agency, not just something from the safeguarding partnership, but also some community stakeholders to look at what are the emerging themes that people can see and are predicting for the future, and then trying to get the evidence base to inform that. Really emphasis on the why question, not just saying I want to commission this, but why do you want to, how do you know, all those kinds of things. So slowing things down and taking a step back. So really having a strategic approach rather than operational, which can sometimes be too operational and inform the wrong thing.
Great. People have mentioned co-production so far, but nobody's said a lot about co-production, about approach to co-production. I'm going to come to the last group now. So we had, I think it's Fiona, Shelley, Christopher and Ashley.
Hello, I was the nominated feedback person, and very, very conveniently, one of our points is all about co-production. And what we thought about co-production is that right from the beginning of the process, we should be really open-minded about what the end result might be, and genuinely start off with a blank sheet of paper, and be really open-minded about what might happen. The other thing we felt was really important to emphasize about co-production is you've got to be realistic about the very considerable resource that it requires to do it properly. Because if you truly want to start off with a blank sheet of paper and co-produce with everyone, the level of engagement, the resources it requires. I mean, let me pick an example might be, materials all have to be accessible. We need to bin all the professional jargon that no one understands, you know, all that kind of stuff. It takes huge amounts of time. So you have to be realistic about the time it will take to co-produce a service, because it will undoubtedly take longer than you want it to. And that kind of links to the point that Kevin was making about this issue between operational and strategic. And too often things become operational, for example, because people don't have enough time. And then finally, just something I think is really important with co-production that we discussed, which Chris raised, was around honesty about money. So sometimes we're redesigning a service because we do need to save money, not always. And Fiona had an example where, you know, she'd done a great piece of co-production where it wasn't about saving money, but that sense of honesty and being open about what's driving this whole piece of work, where we felt was really important. That's the end.
Okay, thank you very much, John. If it's okay with you, I'm going to jump in here. So John's going to be remaining with us for the second part of this session after we've taken a break, but Chris needs to leave us now. So Amana, I'm just going to hand over to you just to do the thank yous to Chris on behalf of the group.
Thank you very much. So thanks, Chris. I think for me, and I'm sure for the colleagues around the room, it was really good to bring that you know, your unique perspective as being the strategic director for commissioning into the room and just taking the theory into practice. And some of the key messages I heard was, you know, making outcomes the real focus, shaping services for your local children by listening to them and listening to your community, and how actually commissioning allows us a unique opportunity to be diverse and have a wider reach within our community and can be really successful. So we really appreciate your time this morning, and thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to all of you. It's always great to meet you and have the conversations we have. And good luck with your future careers. We'll probably catch up another time in the future. So thanks.
Okay, many thanks, Chris. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, folks, so hold on to all the thinking that you've been doing over the last hour and a bit, because all of that will be taken into the second session after coffee.